Have you ever wondered why we don't have better legislation to combat climate change? I have. Without proper legislation, major corporations will continue to abuse the environment because it maximizes their profits. Without proper legislation, individuals will continue to pollute because they do not see immediate consequences or impacts. A corporation is much more likely to pollute if they have little to no consequences. The purpose of this speech is to inform you of the benefits of a carbon tax. In this speech, I will discuss what a carbon tax is, the problems the introduction of a carbon tax would solve, and how a carbon tax would work. That brings you to my first point. What is a carbon tax? According to carbontax.org, a carbon tax is, quote, a fee imposed on burning of carbon-based fuels. A carbon tax is the core policy for reducing and eventually eliminating the use of fossil fuels whose combustion is destabilizing and destroying our climate. In basic terms, a carbon tax charges individuals based on how much carbon-based fuel they use or burn. In my opinion, the only way this tax is feasible is to have it only apply to major corporations, which are the biggest polluters. The goal of this carbon tax is to set the tax so high that it makes more sense for major corporations to either switch to renewable energy or significantly reduce their carbon-based fuels. That brings me to my second point. So what problems would the introduction of a carbon tax solve? As I briefly stated in my last point, this carbon tax would make it more economically feasible for large corporations to switch to renewable energy as opposed to using carbon-based fuels. According to Tess Riley of The Guardian, the 100 biggest companies are responsible for 71% of all global emissions. Therefore, introducing this tax could likely reduce the majority of the world's emissions. Another benefit to this tax is the money it generates. Governments who choose to adopt this tax would receive much more funding from their taxes, and this funding can be used to fund a multitude of other beneficial things. These things include education, other green initiatives, and infrastructure. This tax would likely accelerate the amount of technology that is being engineered to combat climate change because large corporations would be funding it. To elaborate on that, major corporations would be looking to develop cheaper forms of renewable energy to increase their profit margins. This is because currently the most renewable energy sources are more expensive than their carbon-based counterparts. These corporations would also likely develop more efficient forms of renewable energy for similar reasons. That brings you to my internal summary. To summarize what I just discussed, a carbon tax would be a foolproof plan to essentially force major corporations to pay for the damages they impose on the environment and atmosphere. I also discussed how a carbon tax would push these corporations to use renewable energy to increase their profit margins. Next, I discussed how the taxes that are coming from these corporations could be used to fund other green initiatives, infrastructure, or education. And finally, I discussed how more large corporations would be interested in developing cheaper forms of renewable energy so as to increase their profits. And that brings me to my third and final point, which is a brief example for how a carbon tax would work. So basically, an employee of the state would travel to the location of a corporation-owned factory. The state employee would then perform a carbon emissions test on the factory to measure the emissions it produces each day. And then, based on the amount of emissions produced, the employee would calculate the tax due. To conclude, I just discussed what specifically a carbon tax is, the problems the carbon tax would solve, and a brief example for how the carbon tax would work in practice. Here's what you can do to make the carbon tax a reality. First, you'd want to vote for politicians who are willing to act on climate issues. That would usually be more liberal politicians. You would also want to attend environmental rallies/protests that support the adoption of a carbon tax. And finally, you could sign petitions that are looking to adopt a carbon tax. Until major politicians are willing to act on climate change, we will likely see an increasingly rapid decline of our environment. Without the implementation of a carbon tax, we will soon reap the environmental consequences. Thank you.